The coffee in the thin plastic cup had long gone cold, but Irina still wrapped her frozen fingers around it, as if it could warm something deeper than her skin. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic, plastic tubing, and autumn rain carried in on people's coats. Outside the tall window, grey clouds gathered over the old roofs of Chernivtsi, heavy and low, like a lid closing over the city. Bare branches scratched against the glass whenever the wind stirred. On the bed lay a man she had not seen for 9 years. The monitor beside him released a steady mechanical rhythm, a soft, patient beeping that sounded almost like breathing. Ruslan's breathing was slower, uneven, shallow, as if his body had forgotten the simple habit of life. Irina stared at his face. Time had changed him more brutally than she expected. The confident sharpness of his jaw had softened. Faint wrinkles spread from the corners of his eyes like thin cracks in porcelain. His dark hair, once thick and rebellious, was threaded with grey. But even now she recognized him instantly. The same man who once left a set of apartment keys on a cheap bedside table and walked out without listening to the end of her sentence. She had been standing barefoot in the kitchen then, holding a pregnancy test in shaking fingers. The memory pressed against her ribs like a bruise. 2 hours earlier, the ambulance had burst through the hospital doors with flashing lights and hurried voices. The paramedics shouted numbers: blood pressure, oxygen saturation, possible myocardial infarction. Irina had glanced at the patient only once, and the world had tilted beneath her feet. Ruslan. For a moment she had thought exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. But it wasn't. Now his life depended on her. She slowly exhaled and placed the plastic cup on the windowsill. The coffee had formed a thin film on top. Stable for now, she murmured to herself, studying the IV drip. The door creaked softly. Nurse Oksana slipped into the room, carrying a folder of charts. Her voice was cautious, almost apologetic. Irina Viktorievna, the patient's relatives have arrived. Irina didn't look away from the monitor. Who? A woman. She says she's his wife. She's very nervous. For a brief moment, something sharp flickered across Irina's face. Wife. 9 years ago, he had left with nothing but a sports bag and the promise that he needed freedom. Apparently, freedom had eventually turned into marriage. Let her wait in the corridor, Irina said calmly. His condition is still critical. Oksana nodded and disappeared. The room grew quiet again. Irina stepped closer to the bed and listened through the stethoscope. Ruslan's heart beat irregularly, tired and stubborn, like an engine that had run too long without repair. Strange, she thought. Once that heart had broken hers so easily. Now she was responsible for keeping it alive. After a few seconds, she straightened her white coat and walked toward the door. In the corridor, a tall blonde woman stood tapping impatient heels against the worn linoleum floor. Her coat was expensive, the color of pale sand, and her perfume cut sharply through the sterile hospital air. She turned as Irina approached. "You're the doctor?" the woman asked abruptly. "Yes. My name is Alina. I'm Ruslan's wife." Her tone carried irritation rather than fear. "What exactly is going on? Nobody explains anything." Irina studied her for a moment. Perfect makeup, polished nails, eyes more annoyed than worried. "Your husband had a severe heart attack," Irina said evenly. "He's alive because the ambulance arrived quickly." Alina sighed dramatically and pulled out her phone. "This is unbelievable," she muttered. "We have a vacation tomorrow. Tickets, hotel, everything booked. Thousands of dollars." Irina felt a cold smile touch her lips. "Your husband is fortunate to be alive," she said. "He will remain here under observation for several weeks. Flying anywhere is out of the question." Alina rolled her eyes as if discussing a delayed train rather than a man who had nearly died. "Well," she said finally, slipping the phone back into her bag. "Call me when he's ready to leave." She turned and walked toward the exit without another word. Irina watched her go, feeling an unexpected mixture of bitterness and pity. So this was the woman he had chosen. Behind the hospital walls, the wind rattled the branches again. Inside the ward, the monitor kept its quiet rhythm, counting seconds that had suddenly become precious. And somewhere deep inside Irina, something long buried began to stir again, like an old wound remembering how to ache. The hospital corridor smelled of chlorine and wet coats. Irina stood there for a few seconds after Alina disappeared through the glass doors, listening to the fading echo of her heels. Outside, the sky over Chernivtsi had turned darker, and the first thin drops of rain tapped against the windows like cautious fingers. For a moment, Irina allowed herself to breathe. 9 years. 9 years since she had heard Ruslan's voice, seen his careless smile, believed in the wild dreams he carried like maps to a brighter life. She pushed the thought away and returned to the ward. Inside the room, the light was dimmer now. Ruslan still slept, his chest rising slowly beneath the thin hospital blanket. The machine beside him continued its patient counting, a mechanical heartbeat guarding the fragile one inside his body. Irina checked the IV, adjusted the drip, and noted the numbers on the monitor. Professional, precise, distant. That was the safest way to survive the next days. Yet the past slipped through her mind anyway. She remembered their first date. Not in a restaurant or a noisy cafe, but in the abandoned greenhouses of the botanical garden. Ruslan had known a broken section of fence where they could slip inside unnoticed. They had climbed onto the wooden steps beneath cracked glass panels while rain drummed above them. The air had smelled of damp soil and forgotten flowers. He talked endlessly that evening, about business ideas, about traveling across Europe, about cities where streets never slept. His eyes burned with restless energy. And she, a naive medical student with textbooks under her arm, had believed every word. Later, they rented a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and windows that rattled when trams passed. Money was always short. Irina worked part-time as a nurse while studying. Ruslan chased opportunities that never quite materialized. Still, she had believed in him. Until the day she ran home with trembling excitement, clutching the test that changed everything. He had stood by the window listening. He didn't shout. He simply grew pale. "I'm not ready," he said quietly. The words had fallen like stones. A child, he explained, would ruin everything. The plans, the partners he had just met, the project that might finally make him successful. Irina had cried, tried to reason, tried to remind him that life rarely waited for perfect timing. But Ruslan had already made his decision. He packed a bag, left the keys on the bedside table, and walked out while she was still speaking. The memory ended the same way it always did, with the hollow silence of a closing door. Irina blinked and returned to the present. Ruslan stirred slightly on the bed. His eyelids twitched, then slowly opened. For a moment his gaze wandered unfocused across the ceiling. Then it found her. Confusion flickered first, then recognition struck like lightning. "Iro," he whispered. His voice sounded fragile, like dry leaves brushing together. Irina's expression did not change. "Good morning, Ruslan," she said calmly, opening his medical chart. "I'm your doctor. How are you feeling?" He stared at her as if trying to wake from a dream. "You work here?" "Yes." He tried to push himself up, but a sharp wave of weakness forced him back against the pillow. "Don't move," she said firmly. "Your heart can't handle sudden strain." Ruslan studied her face, disbelief slowly turning into something softer. "You haven't changed," he murmured. "Not at all." Inside her chest, something tightened painfully. Outwardly, she remained composed. "Deep breath," she said, placing the stethoscope against his chest. He obeyed. The heartbeat beneath her fingers felt uneven, tired, a rhythm walking on thin ice. After a moment, she wrote several notes in the chart. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "Another 30 minutes and the damage would have been irreversible." Ruslan turned his head toward the window. "My wife came, didn't she?" "Yes." A faint, bitter smile crossed his lips. She was probably upset about the vacation. Irina closed the chart. It seemed important to her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Only the machine continued its soft counting. Then Ruslan looked back at her. "Ira, wait." She paused near the door. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely, "for the way everything ended back then." The words hung in the air, fragile and late. Irina stood very still. 9 years of silence condensed into a single sentence. Finally she answered, her voice calm but cold. "That mistake belongs to the past, Ruslan. Right now your heart matters more than apologies." She opened the door. Behind her the monitor continued its steady rhythm, unaware that somewhere deeper another heart had begun beating much faster. The shift dragged on like a long grey thread that refused to break. Irina moved from one ward to another, examining patients, adjusting treatments, filling endless charts with careful handwriting. Her voice sounded calm and professional, her movements precise, almost mechanical. But her thoughts kept returning to the same room at the end of the corridor, to the pale man lying beneath the quiet blinking lights of a heart monitor. By the time evening came, the hospital windows had turned black mirrors, reflecting fluorescent lamps and tired faces. Irina finally removed her white coat, folded it over her arm, and stepped outside. Cold air brushed her cheeks like wet silk. The city was alive with ordinary evening noise. Cars crawling through traffic, people hurrying toward buses, shop windows glowing warmly along the streets. Chernivtsi had always felt small, intimate, almost protective. Yet for 9 years it had somehow managed to keep her and Ruslan apart, as if the city itself had respected the fragile walls she built around her past. She climbed into a crowded minibus that smelled faintly of damp jackets and diesel fuel. The vehicle jerked forward, stopping every few blocks. Through the fogged glass, Irina watched the familiar streets slide by, and memories began to rise again. She remembered the tiny apartment they once shared, the chipped kitchen table, the old kettle that whistled too loudly, the mattress that creaked whenever they turned in their sleep. They had laughed a lot back then, even when the refrigerator was nearly empty, especially then. The bus lurched to a stop, pulling her back to the present, her stop. She stepped off and walked into the nearby supermarket, buying bread, milk, and a few apples. Simple things. The routine of a life carefully built from scratch. By the time she climbed the worn stairs of her apartment building, her shoulders felt heavy with fatigue. She unlocked the door. Before she could even step inside, a small figure rushed toward her. "Mom!" 8-year-old Maxim wrapped his arms around her waist with the unstoppable force of childhood. "I did my homework," he announced proudly. "Even the math one, and it was really hard." Irina smiled, despite the exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. "Well done, my champion," she said softly, kissing his messy dark hair. The apartment smelled faintly of yesterday's borscht and laundry detergent. Warm, ordinary, safe. "Grandma called," Maxim added. "She asked if we had food. I told her we still have soup." "Then we'll have soup again," Irina said with a small laugh. "But first, wash your hands." They ate at the tiny kitchen table under the yellow light of an old lamp. Maxim talked endlessly about school, about a boy who brought a turtle for show and tell, about a drawing contest he wanted to win. Irina listened, nodding, watching the boy's animated face. He had Ruslan's eyes, the same deep brown, almost black in dim light. Every time she noticed it, a strange ache passed quietly through her chest. But Maxim himself was nothing like the man who left. He was gentle, thoughtful. He always helped carry groceries and carefully saved his pocket coins to buy her small surprises: chocolates, cheap flowers, colorful stickers. Later that night, the apartment grew quiet. Maxim slept in the next room, his breathing soft and steady. Irina lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Images from the hospital replayed again and again in her mind. Ruslan's pale face, his fragile heartbeat on the monitor, and the words he had spoken earlier. "I'm sorry." The apology stirred anger she thought had long turned to stone. Part of her wanted to walk into his hospital room tomorrow and tell him the truth. Tell him everything. Tell him about the child he had abandoned before even knowing him. She imagined his reaction, the shock, the guilt, the sudden collapse of the life he had built without them. For a moment, the idea felt almost satisfying. But then she remembered the trembling rhythm on the monitor, his heart barely holding together. One emotional shock could stop it entirely. Irina turned onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. In the darkness, she could hear Maxim shift slightly in his sleep. Her son, the only person who had never left her. Quietly, almost like a promise whispered to herself, she murmured, "You don't need him." Outside, the autumn wind rattled the bare branches against the window, and somewhere across the city, in a quiet hospital room filled with dim lights and quiet machines, the man who had once walked out of her life slept with a heart that might not survive the truth. Morning came to the hospital with the smell of fresh disinfectant and the dull hum of fluorescent lights. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky over Chernivtsi remained the color of old steel. Irina tied her hair into a strict ponytail, slipped into her white coat, and began the morning rounds. When she reached Ruslan's room, he was already awake. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling as if counting the invisible cracks in the paint. The monitor beside him blinked steadily, its green line rising and falling with cautious persistence. For a moment she simply watched him. 9 years had passed, yet the strange familiarity of his presence unsettled her in ways she could not easily control. She stepped inside. Ruslan turned his head at the sound of her footsteps. Recognition appeared immediately in his tired eyes. "Good morning, doctor," he said quietly. The word doctor sounded deliberate, almost respectful. "Good morning," she replied, scanning the monitor. "How's the pressure in your chest?" "A little tight, but better than yesterday." She listened to his heart again. The rhythm was still fragile, but more stable. When she finished writing notes, Ruslan spoke again. "Irina, may I ask something?" She kept her eyes on the chart. "That depends on the question." He gave a faint, crooked smile. "Did you stay here in Chernivtsi all these years?" "Yes." "And your life, did it turn out the way you wanted?" The question lingered between them like a thin wire stretched too tight. Irina closed the chart. "My life turned out exactly as it needed to." Ruslan studied her carefully. "You always wanted to become a surgeon." "I'm a cardiologist now," she said evenly. "Life changes plans." "So do people." The words were quiet, but the meaning behind them pressed heavily into the silence. Before she could respond, the door opened abruptly. Alina entered the room wearing dark sunglasses despite the grey morning. She carried a leather handbag and a look of impatient irritation. "Oh, good, you're awake," she said to Ruslan without greeting. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Irina. "I brought your things. Clothes, charger, whatever." She dropped a sports bag onto the chair. Ruslan looked exhausted already. "Thank you." Alina crossed her arms. "By the way, I spoke to the travel agency. If we get a medical certificate confirming hospitalization, we might still recover 30% of the vacation cost." Ruslan closed his eyes slowly. "Alina, I nearly died." "Yes, and that's terrible," she replied quickly, waving her hand as if brushing away a fly. "But the money is also terrible." Irina felt something cold settle inside her chest. Ruslan opened his eyes again, but he didn't look at his wife. "I need rest," he said quietly. Alina sighed dramatically. "Fine, I'll stay with my mother for a few days. Hospitals make me uncomfortable." She picked up her handbag and turned toward the door. Just before leaving, she glanced back. "Oh, doctor, please prepare that certificate." Then she disappeared into the corridor. Silence returned. Ruslan stared at the window for a long time. "I suppose you heard enough to understand my marriage," he said finally. Irina adjusted the IV line. "I'm not interested in your personal life, Ruslan." He let out a weak breath. "When the pain started yesterday, when I fell on the floor and couldn't breathe," his voice grew rough, "I realized something strange." She didn't answer. "I realized that if I died," he continued quietly, "there would be almost no one who truly cared." His fingers trembled slightly on the blanket. "I have money, a business, a big apartment, but none of it means anything lying here." Irina's hand froze for a moment on the drip regulator. "We never had children," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "Alina never wanted them, and I kept saying there was plenty of time." The words struck her like a sudden electric shock. We never had children. The truth rushed towards her lips before she could stop it. "You have a son, an 8-year-old boy with dark eyes and messy hair who eats borscht and hates math homework." The sentence burned inside her throat, but then she looked at the monitor. The pulse line jumped sharply with every emotional word he spoke. His heart was still too weak, too fragile. Irina swallowed the truth like bitter medicine. "You need rest," she said calmly. "Thinking about the past won't help your recovery." Ruslan looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something he could not quite find. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right." She turned and walked toward the door. But once outside, leaning against the cold wall of the corridor, Irina closed her eyes for a moment. Her heart was beating much faster than the one she had just examined. 3 days passed with a fragile kind of calm. Ruslan's condition slowly improved. The grey shade left his skin, his breathing became steadier, and the terrifying alarms on the monitor stopped interrupting the silence of the ward. The doctors called it stabilization, a careful word that meant the danger had stepped back but had not completely disappeared. Irina kept her distance. She performed the necessary examinations, checked his medication, and left the room as quickly as professional etiquette allowed. Most of the time, Nurse Oksana handled the routine procedures, yet Ruslan always tried to speak when she appeared. He asked about her work, about the hospital, about the city they both once dreamed of leaving. His voice carried no arrogance now, only a strange, quiet curiosity, as if he were examining the ruins of a life he had abandoned. Irina answered politely but briefly. Her real life waited somewhere else. That evening, when her shift finally ended, she left the hospital exhausted. The sky over Chernivtsi had cleared after days of rain, and the air smelled of wet leaves and distant smoke from chimneys. At home, the apartment lights were already on. Maxim sat on the floor in the living room, building an uneven tower from plastic blocks. "Mom," he shouted happily the moment he saw her. "Look, it's a hospital tower." She laughed softly and dropped her bag. "A hospital tower?" "Yes," he explained seriously. "Doctors live at the top so they can see everyone." Irina kissed his forehead. "Then I suppose I'll have to move in." Later, after dinner and homework, Maxim fell asleep quickly. His small body curled beneath the blanket, one hand still holding a toy car. Irina watched him for a long time. In sleep, he looked even more like Ruslan. The same eyebrows, the same stubborn line of the mouth. A familiar ache stirred quietly inside her chest. That night, she slept badly. Near midnight, the phone rang sharply in the dark. Irina grabbed it immediately. "Hello?" It was Oksana. "Irina Viktorievna, I'm sorry to call so late. Something strange happened." "What is it? Did Ruslan's condition worsen?" "No, not exactly, but he asked for paper and a pen this afternoon. About an hour ago, a man in a suit arrived. A notary." Irina sat up in bed. "A notary?" "They stayed inside the room for almost 2 hours," Oksana continued nervously. "When the man left, Ruslan gave me an envelope and told me to give it to you personally tomorrow morning." A cold uneasiness crept into Irina's stomach. "How does he look now?" "Very pale, breathing heavily. I wanted to call the night doctor, but he refused." "I'll come early," Irina said quietly. She didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, the hospital corridors seemed unusually silent. Oksana was waiting outside the nurse's station, holding a plain white envelope. "Here," she said. Irina took it. Her name was written across the front in uneven handwriting. Inside were several sheets of paper. The first one was an official document stamped with a notary seal, a will. Irina's eyes scanned the lines quickly and then froze. Ruslan had transferred almost everything he owned, his apartment, business shares, bank accounts, all of it, to Maxim. Her fingers tightened around the paper. The second sheet was a letter. "Irina, you were right about everything. I have no right to interfere in your life or in the life of the son I abandoned before he was even born. But lying here these days made me understand something clearly. I may not live long enough to repair what I destroyed. Doctors talk about surgery, about long treatments. I don't know if my heart will survive it. I cannot become the father he deserved. But I can at least make sure he has a future. This is not payment. It is simply the only decent decision I have made in many years. Tell him about me someday, not as a hero, but as a man who was foolish and cowardly, but tried at the very end to do one thing right. Ruslan." Irina lowered the letter slowly. She had expected anger, accusations, perhaps even threats, but not surrender. Not this quiet admission of defeat. Without another thought, she walked quickly down the corridor toward his room. When she pushed the door open, Ruslan was lying on his side facing the window. His breathing was heavy. The morning light fell across his face, making him look even older. "You decided to give up?" Irina asked sharply, throwing the envelope onto the bedside table. He turned his head slowly. "This isn't giving up," he said weakly. "It's leaving something behind. You're planning your death instead of fighting for your life." A faint, tired smile appeared on his lips. "Maybe I'm just realistic." Irina stared at him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "You're wrong about one thing, Ruslan." He frowned slightly.
You said you have nothing to fight for. She stepped closer to the bed. And that, she added softly, is not entirely true. For a long moment, Ruslan simply looked at her, as if trying to understand the meaning hidden behind her last words. The machines beside the bed hummed softly. Morning light crept across the pale walls of the hospital room, touching the metal rails of the bed and the quiet rise and fall of his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked finally. Irina didn't answer immediately. Her hands rested on the edge of the mattress, fingers tense against the thin fabric of the blanket. 9 years of silence stood between them like a wall built from countless small bricks. Anger, sleepless nights, fear, stubborn pride. But something inside her had shifted. Perhaps it was the letter, perhaps the fragile way he breathed, or perhaps the quiet memory of a little boy sleeping in the next room of her apartment. "You once said a child would destroy your plans," she said slowly. Ruslan's eyes darkened with shame. "I remember." She lifted her gaze and met his. "You were right about one thing."
It did change everything. The room grew very still. Ruslan frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his tired face. "Irina, what are you trying to say?" Her voice was calm, but the words felt heavy in her chest. "You do have something to fight for," she said quietly. Then she paused. "You have a son." For a moment the words seemed not to reach him at all. Ruslan stared at her, blinking slowly. Then the meaning struck. His fingers tightened weakly around the edge of the blanket. "A son?" Irina nodded. "Maxim. He's 8. The monitor beside the bed beeped faster for a second, reacting to the sudden shock. Ruslan's lips parted, but no sound came out. 8 years. The number hung in the air like an accusation. "I didn't tell you," Irina continued carefully, watching the monitor. "You made your choice that night. You left before you could hear the rest of the sentence." A tear slid quietly down Ruslan's temple into the pillow. "My God," he whispered. Images flooded his mind. The tiny apartment, the rain on the greenhouse glass, the moment he walked away with his bag. 8 years. A whole childhood beginning without him. "Does he know about me?" Ruslan asked hoarsely. "No," Irina's answer came quickly. "I told him his father died in an accident abroad. I didn't want him growing up believing he was abandoned." Ruslan closed his eyes. The weight of those words pressed harder than the pain in his chest. "I deserved that," he said after a moment. Silence settled again. Outside the window, the autumn clouds were finally breaking apart, thin lines of sunlight touching the rooftops of the city. Ruslan opened his eyes once more. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he said quietly, "and I won't demand anything from him. I lost that right the day I walked out." His breathing steadied slightly. "But if I survive this surgery, if I have even the smallest chance," he swallowed, "could I see him one day? Just once, even if he never calls me father." Irina studied his face. The arrogance she once knew was gone. What remained was a tired man holding the fragile possibility of redemption. "You'll need the operation," she said finally, "and months of recovery." "I'll do it." "You'll have to fight harder than you ever have before." Ruslan gave a faint, determined nod. "I will." For the first time since she had seen him again, Irina allowed a small breath of relief to escape her chest. "Then survive," she said softly. He looked at her with quiet gratitude. Outside, sunlight slowly spread across the city streets. Weeks later, Ruslan was transferred to a clinic in Kiev for surgery. The operation lasted nearly 10 hours. There were moments when his heart stopped completely, but it started again. Months passed. Winter came and went, and early spring returned to Chernivtsi with the smell of melting snow and damp earth. One afternoon, as Irina walked home from work, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance of her building. Ruslan. He looked thinner, older, leaning slightly on a cane, but alive. Their eyes met across the small courtyard. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. Irina studied him for a moment. Then she nodded toward the playground where Maxim was running after a bright red ball. "Come," she said. Ruslan followed her slowly. The boys stopped when they approached. "Maxim," Irina said gently, placing a hand on her son's shoulder, "this is someone very important." Ruslan knelt carefully despite the weakness in his legs. He looked into the same dark eyes he had once seen in the mirror every morning. "Hello," he said softly. The boy tilted his head curiously. "Do I know you?" Ruslan's voice trembled slightly. "I hope you will." Irina watched them both, the past and the future standing only a few steps apart, and for the first time in many years, the heavy stone inside her heart felt lighter. Some mistakes could never be erased, but sometimes life offered something just as powerful, the right to forgiveness.